Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm one of the co-founders of Balancing Act, and welcome to this webinar on budget engagement strategy. Balancing Act produces a series of webinars throughout the year on various aspects of budget participation, transparency, accountability, and this is one that is devoted specifically to strategy. So this one is not going to be about any particular tool. It's more about the things that you as local government leaders will need to think through as you design your strategy for budget engagement. Joining me today are two terrific local government experts that have some experience with our tool, with Balancing Act. We have Megan Graham from La Plata County, Colorado, and Adam Blong from Kansas City, Missouri, and we will introduce them in just a moment. Let me quickly go over the agenda for today. We're going to begin by talking about what's your why for budget engagement, why do this, and then we're going to hear two cases, one from La Plata County, Colorado, and then Kansas City, Missouri, and we'll have local government experts talking about that from their own perspectives. And then we've got a framework that we use here to help plan a budget strategy, and we'll sort of walk through some of those elements. And then I want to talk about one that unfortunately seems to be a growing situation, budget engagement in an economic downturn. That doesn't necessarily mean for the economy in general, but it's referring more to the specific circumstances that might be faced by a local government, and we'll talk about some of those reasons why that's the case. And then we'll open up for a discussion. These webinars are best when people participate, so I want to invite everyone to participate. You should have a little floating control panel or toolbar, and there's a little hand icon that you can click. If you want to make a comment or have a question or just join the discussion, just go ahead and click that hand, and we'll call on you just as soon as we can. All right, so let's go ahead and keep moving. This slide just talks about the various reasons why local governments do budget participation. Now, here at the Balancing Act, we work with about 50 different local governments, and we've heard a lot of reasons for doing this. I'll start with the one that's probably the important but least motivating, and that is that GFOA recommends it. That it's recommended both by GFOA and ICMA, and civic engagement in general is seen as a positive thing for local governments to be doing. But in particular on the budget, there's some strong recommendations for doing this. One of the problems is that there have not been very good tools for that, and we're hoping that as we get more sophisticated with both face-to-face and online techniques, that will get better. We have a number of local governments that come to us just because they think it's the right thing to do, that they're proud of what they're doing as a local government, and they just feel as though tax dollars belong to residents, and residents should have a reasonable opportunity to both understand and provide input. It ties in with transparency and accountability trends that we're seeing throughout local government, especially in an age of information where information can be pretty readily accessed. Another time when we see people is during declining revenues or increasing expenses, the sort of pinch points. There's some evidence that says that local government, that in times of crisis or retrenchment, when there is a gap, that budget engagement is even more important than in the good times. And I think we've heard that repeatedly from elected officials, that if there's a vision to be set for a surplus, if you're in that relatively unusual situation where you've got a surplus, that elected officials and senior staff of local governments, they often have a long wish list of things that they would like to see funded in a vision for that. But when it comes time to retrenching or cutting back, that's a very common time when you want to engage people, because they're losing something, whether it's their tax dollars or the potential of losing some services. Often, in particular political climates, there's a pressure to reduce spending, and when you're reducing spending and taking something away, once again, it's a good time to engage folks. We have a number of entities that want to work with us if they're anticipating the need for a tax increase, whether it's just to keep up with the ongoing costs of what they're doing, or if they want to do something new, they want to build a library, They want to deal with some infrastructure issues and so forth. We have a number of places, such as in California and Colorado, where this is particularly important because those states require a vote of the people, a vote of residents, in order to increase taxes. More and more local governments are coming to us with structural issues such as legacy infrastructure that needs to be replaced, big ticket items that are sort of percolating underneath the surface but are very important, very expensive, and it's hard to explain to residents why they might need to spend some dollars now for things that might be underneath their streets that they may never see, but certainly if it's something like stormwater, you want to make sure that you've adequately maintained those systems. And then the other one is pensions. There's a number of pension issues where there's some concern about underfunding. And then this last one is one, I actually just added this, but this was suggested to me by somebody at eRepublic, the publishers of Governing Magazine and Government Technology. And they were just talking about transparency has gotten to be a fairly ubiquitous feature of most local governments. But the problem is that there's not as much value with it. That just making a checkbook online or a PDF of the budget online, there's really not that much value. There might be a little bit of value in terms of it being available, but there's not much of an interaction. And so by seeking out ways to do budget participation where it's both informative and interactive, and you can actually draw people in and get them to help you learn what's important to them, we believe there's a lot more value in that. Okay, let me just do a couple of pictures to show you. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it just talks about various institutions and how much trust there is. And so it talks about NGOs, business, media, and then government. But the thing that I wanted to point out to folks is that in the instance where they have what they call an informed public, and they define that, and I'm not going to spend too much time saying how they define that, but when you have an informed public that's paying attention versus the general population, there's a huge gap in trust. And so for government, when you have an informed public, you have more than half expressing trust in that institution of government. When people are the general population, it drops by 8 points. And so what this tells us is that it's worth finding accessible ways for people to have some interaction and some good information about what's going on. And one of the problems with the budget is it's really just been opaque for so many people to try to understand it. And by the time a budget hearing happens, a lot of the decisions have already been made and the priorities have been baked into it, and there's not much of an opportunity to provide input, much less even understand it. And so finding some easier ways for people to understand it is something that we think is a great value. This is a statistic that's gleaned from a study done in California that just talks about the belief that sales tax rate is too high when people are. And as you can see, they also came up with their own definitions. They have a continuum of people that are uninformed to informed and disengaged to engaged. And what you see here is that when people are uninformed and disengaged, that there's about a 48% likelihood that they believe that their sales tax rate is too high. But when people are informed and engaged, that they understand where those dollars are going, there is a precipitous drop down to about 28%, I think. And so what that tells us is that if there are some effective ways to get people informed and engaged, that has some value to you, regardless of whether or not you might be asking for a tax increase or not. Just people's attitude towards government and how they feel about taxes. Just yesterday, there was an article that was or not an article, but a story that was broadcast on Colorado Public Radio, and it featured a speaker named Sten Steinmo, and he worked with us about 10 months ago to do a national study on people's attitudes towards the federal debt and the federal deficit. And what they found is that, and they used our balancing act simulation as the research instrument. And what they found was that as people learned more and engaged more with the federal budget, that they were very willing to come up with practical solutions, both to potential revenue shortfalls, cutting spending in order to trim deficits and reduce debt, and just overall that people actually can understand these things if you put it in a format that they can access it. This next one is just I call magical thinking. Magical thinking being residents or even some elected officials demand that services be increased at the same time that the taxes are decreased. It's, you know, maybe in some world there might be some way of doing that, but it's not really very apparent how you do that. And so by having people who are informed and engaged, you severely limit that thinking, which we think is a very positive thing. The next thing I want to do is just to go over what many of you have probably already seen. It's called the IAP2 spectrum of public participation. And these aren't evaluative. We're not necessarily saying that you should be moving toward the right. It just sort of identifies what local government's goals might be for doing public participation. And so on the one hand, they have inform, so just providing information with to residents in an accessible way. Consult, where you're trying to get a little bit of feedback in terms of what might make sense moving forward. Involving is a little bit more direct in getting, trying to elicit some of those preferences from your residents. Moving on to collaborate is a little bit further, and then empower. And when I first started thinking about this spectrum with regards to budget engagement, I really thought that no one would ever want to do empower. But we periodically sample our clients and others to see where they fall on this. And what we found is that there's actually a fair number that want to empower, and it's not necessarily because they think it's good governance, it's because it's the reality. If you're living in a state that requires a vote of the people in order to increase the tax rate, effectively the decision-making authority on taxes is in the hands of your residents. And so if empower is really where your residents are, you want to make sure that they've got the information they need so that they're not making a poor decision. And so it really places an imperative and a need on doing high quality budget engagement and budget participation. All right, let me move on now, and we haven't done a test on this or not yet, to our first speaker, and she is Megan Graham, and I hope that she's on. Let me see here. Megan, are you there? Let's see here.
Here.
There you are, it looks like. Oh, good. All right, so I'm going to let Megan introduce herself, but she's been a terrific colleague to meet and discuss down in the southwestern part of Colorado, and she is a public affairs officer. We've got the pleasure today of both having somebody who is coming at this principally from the discipline of public affairs and communications, and then our friend from Kansas City, Adam Blom, is going to be talking about it as a budget analyst. So Megan, let me just turn it over to you to sort of introduce yourself first, and then I'll go to the next slide that has the challenge statement that you created. But we're very glad to have you, Megan, and looking forward to hearing what some of your thinking is about how budget engagement can be useful and maybe even an imperative for La Plata County, given your circumstances.
All right, will do. Thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. So my name is Megan. I've been with La Plata County for going on 2 years now in the public affairs function. I work closely with our commissioners, our county manager, department heads, and other electeds to help communicate the work that we do at the county, as well as to engage folks in the community with what we're doing and get them involved in policy decisions and make folks aware of what we're up to. So as far as the budget engagement stuff, the Balancing Act tool has been a really important opportunity for us because we're sort of looking all along the spectrum of public participation, landing mostly in the middle three, but there's certainly elements of informing that kind of lead to the next, and ultimately we want to empower our community to help make some decisions regarding how to invest in our community. We're an oil and gas producing community, or historically have been, and so we've been able to rely heavily on property taxes from natural gas production for decades, until the last probably 6 or 7 years, when things have fallen off precipitously in terms of price and production nationwide as well as here. We have a very low mill levy rate, property tax rate, which requires a vote of the people to increase. And because we've been able to rely on oil and gas for so long, our voters have been hesitant to make that increase. So what we have set out to do in kind of in a comprehensive way is to engage our community in developing priorities for service. What kind of community do we want to be? So some visioning exercise, and how do we want to invest in that? So the Balancing Act for us is an instrumental tool, and we're just going to be rolling it out in January. That helps folks understand what the constraints of our budget are, the services that we have to provide, what we do provide in addition to those services, and then where and how our opportunities to increase that investment fall out. So we've been spending a lot of time just kind of figuring out how do you present the various budget categories, but also how to ask the questions that lead the thinking into creating that community vision and then ultimately articulating what people are willing to invest. So there's my spiel. I don't know if folks have questions.
Well, and if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I've got one. You're as a public affairs officer, you're the less typical type of person that we would work with here at Balancing Act. I'm just sort of wondering, how do you see? Does your local government, does LaPlata County see this more as a engagement communications task, or do they see it more as a budget finance function? And then I'm also interested because I've seen some comments in the media from your county commissioners that the county commissioners actually seem to be pretty fully on board with what you're doing. How is this something that you feel like is being led primarily from one or other department or professional staff versus elected officials, or does it feel like it's sort of integrated throughout the whole organization?
Well, it's definitely being led from a communication standpoint, but with tremendous support from and reliance on finance, both in terms of the data and making sure we're being consistent in the storytelling between, kind of our larger county message and the budget as we develop it for 2018. It's actually being adopted right now as we speak. But the tool came to us and to me as a communications medium largely and a community engagement strategy. And that's how the commissioners see it as well. I don't know that we're using it necessarily to build a budget for 2019, but rather to kind of help us understand what community priorities are, while at the same time being able to be transparent in a way that's accessible to the community.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for that. And Megan, I've since we had our prep phone call, I've added a couple slides a little bit later on that talk about some communications tools for budget, and I might ask you to come back and comment on those after you've had a chance to see them.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's move on to Adam now, and his is preceded by some photos. In Kansas City, they've been doing some really great work, especially with combining high tech and high touch. And so they've been one of the first big cities to use our meeting mode. These are just some photos that Adam sent from a meeting. I think it was about 6 or 8 weeks ago. But it was really fun to see residents getting together and really having these important conversations. And Adam gave me what I think is one of my favorite quotes of 2017, and that shows up on this slide right now. And he was commenting on the residents that participated in these budget workshops, and we often we hear from budget officers in particular, I think more so than other functions within local government, that they just don't think that residents care and that they don't want to take the time to sort of understand the constraints and the difficult trade-offs. But this was Adam's observation. He said, the amazing thing is that residents are almost silent as they go through the exercise because they are concentrating so hard on making these decisions. And that's very much been our experience too. We've been trying to blend high touch and high tech for about 11 years now in our budget engagement work, and the meeting mode that Kansas City and Adam have been using, I think, is really a nice tool for doing that. Let me introduce Adam now. Adam, please go ahead and say a little bit more by way of introduction of yourself, and after you do that, I'll go to your slide that talks about your challenge and where you see your public participation goal.
Sure. Well, So I'm with Kansas City. I've been in the budget office for a little while now, but I actually started out in our 311, and so I have seen city operations from a few different perspectives, and it's really interesting to see it from both sides. So since I moved to the budget office, well, and before that as well, but engagement has been very important for the city of Kansas City because we face a lot of big city challenges. So for those who may not know, Kansas City, we're an older city. We have a lot of infrastructure problems. We need to repair a lot of roads and replace a lot of water lines and sewer lines and all that. But also we are trying to be, and I think doing a pretty good job, of being a modern world-class city. So we're doing things like building a streetcar line downtown. We've put in, within the last 10 years, an event center downtown. New apartment buildings downtown are popping up like crazy. We're doing a convention center hotel. And so there's all this pressure to develop that as well, and including putting in a new airport for those of you who may have not heard. So even though we have all these existing things that we need to replace, we're also putting in a lot of new stuff. And one of the challenges we have in relation to that is that Missouri state law basically handcuffs us as far as revenues go. So we have an earnings tax that's fixed at 1%. We cannot change. It's in the Missouri state law. We also have state constitutional amendment that limits property taxes to CPI or 2%, the lower of the two. And then we have sales tax that's limited, and when we do increase the sales tax, we have to dedicate it to a certain purpose, although in Kansas City we've, I think, utilized all but a quarter of a cent of our authority. So we don't have a lot of room to increase it. So our goal is to find out what residents really want, because we really can't add new services just by adding money. So we have at least two-step process here in Kansas City. We start off with our business plan meetings, and we adopt a citywide business plan that then drives our budget. And so we just went through in September our business planning sessions, and then our budget will ultimately get adopted in this March. So we have our budget sessions upcoming still. But for the business plan session, we do a mirror of our budget process. So we start off our meetings, which we had 4, with kind of just a visioning session. This is where residents just get to sort of discuss in groups what their hopes and dreams are for the future. And this is always pretty popular. Residents get to, discuss what they like and what they don't like, and people like to talk about that. So that's great, and it's good feedback for us. But it can be hard to quantify that. So we also did an activity to prioritize, and so we listed all of our goals and objectives, and we had residents vote using a clicker technology, which was really quick and effective. And we also had experts from city departments on hand to answer any questions that people had, and we encouraged asking as many questions as they needed. And then after we'd done all that, then we sort of made them put rubber to the road. And this is where we unveiled our balancing act activity, the meeting mode. And so we had residents go through different departments and different goal areas. We'd force them to make priority choices like roads or sidewalks, or trash collection or animal control. And there were dollar values associated to those. And then they would have to somehow increase and reduce in order to come up with some sort of balanced scenario. And as Chris said, especially with the last activity, we did have people on hand to answer questions, and we encouraged them to answer questions. But, as a presenter, you always want some sort of engagement. You want a little back and forth. But, man, they were just silent, concentrating on trying to make those decisions and going back and forth. And I know at the end there were some pretty big deficits they had to go back and cut and make fix. And so it was definitely interesting and really enjoyable. And the nice thing about doing both the prioritization exercise and the balancing act exercise is that at the end it really gives you some numbers you can quantify. And we put that into a report we presented to our city council, and then we also sent that report out to all the participants and all of our city council members and our mayor. So we really take it seriously, and we try to get a really good result that we can utilize for budgeting.
That's great. That's impressive work, and it's what I love about this is that there seems to be an ongoing commitment in Kansas City to do this year over year, and the tool is less important than the commitment of doing it. I remember one of some of the best leadership I've seen from elected officials comes from, I don't know if he still holds this office or not, but your mayor pro tem. Is it Scott Wagner? Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. He was at all the sessions. He made sure he spoke up and emphasized the importance of it all. Yeah, he's great.
Right. And he's also, isn't he the chair of your finance committee?
Yes, he also does that. So he has a vested interest in it.
Right. But it is interesting because we sometimes run across elected officials who see too much budget participation as a liability. They feel as though they were elected, and they don't really need residents to weigh in on this. That's one view. The other view is more like Scott, which is that they want to have this good information, and that they really appreciate staff finding ways to make this useful information. Is Scott unusual on your council, or is he more the norm, do you think?
Well, all of the city council members were very supportive, including the mayor. All of our elected officials were very supportive of it. They showed up and encouraged their constituents to attend and to participate and to take it seriously. The only thing that I guess I can say to counter that is that I don't think everyone was happy with what the results were. So everybody wanted the participation, but when it didn't conform to their perception, I think that was a bit of a shock. So, we'll see how the budget ends up this year, and everyone appreciated the work and the participation and everything, but when the results don't match your expectations, I think that can be a surprise to some people.
Interesting. Yeah, and for me at least, I would view that as an opportunity for a conversation, because one thing we've always been clear about here at Balancing Act is that by doing budget simulation and budget participation, you're not ceding the authority of city officials and elected officials to make the budget. You're simply creating a conversation where you can get some informed input.
Absolutely, and to be, I think, fair, when there was one thing that particularly stuck out where people's stated goal was one thing, but where they funded when we actually did the balancing activity was quite a bit different. And I think there was some perception that one department provided the type of service they were looking for, and that may not be the case. So, it's sometimes you can look at providing the same result using different techniques, and that can be a discussion to be had.
Yeah, no, that's great. And once again, that's a good attribute of a local government that's made a commitment to do this over time, is that you learn those types of things and that you can have those types of conversations. Well, thank you very much, Adam. I'm looking forward to both you and Megan commenting further as we go through this next section. So please, if you have anything to say, both Megan and Adam, or anybody else, just let me know. It looks like Kate Hoyer, has asked a question. And Kate, it looks like, are you from, Kate, I'm just going to unmute you, if that's okay, and see if you can ask your question. So you're unmuted now, Kate.
Oh, hi. I'm just wondering.
And would you say where you're from, please?
We're calling from City of Largo, Florida.
All right, nice to have you.
Wondering if there was a tool used to gauge the priorities quickly. You mentioned that it was done kind of in a quick manner, and I just wondered if there was like a digital or some kind of tech that you used.
For the prioritization, we used, I think it's called iClicker, And so we put the choices up on the board, and people got to choose, I think, A, B, C, D, or E. And so depending on how much conversation you want to, I guess, encourage, it goes really quickly. It only takes maybe 5 or 10 minutes to go through 10 questions. So.
Thank you.
And then one thing I'll be talking about in a little bit here is the relative value of surveys versus simulation, and there's actually some pretty interesting stuff on that I'll talk about as well. But thank you for that question. All right, let me see if I can keep going here. So as I said, this next section, we often help local governments come up with their budget engagement plan, and you know, that old saying that once you know one small town or one local government, you know exactly one small town or one local government. Everybody's unique, but there are some common things to think about, and so we've come up with we call it 20 questions for a budget engagement, and I'm not going to go through answering each of them now. I'm just really going to share with you what they are. This is the type of thing that we would do if we were, you know, going to spend 2 or 3 hours working with a group of staff or maybe a staff with 1 or 2 elected officials. But the first thing the 6 goal or the 6 steps that we see are identifying your goals, developing your strategy, selecting and building your tools, whether or not it's a simulation or a survey or a workshop, whatever, the implementation, collecting and analyzing, and then finally communicating results so that both your residents know what you learned, but also so that elected officials do and senior staff that are making some of these important prioritization decisions. Once again, identifying goals, these are some prompts that we've created that we found to be helpful. This first question is the question that I almost always ask when somebody approaches me about doing some type of budget engagement. Is I ask them, what do you wish that your residents knew about your financial condition? So it could be, as in Megan's case, it could be that much of the county is funded by revenue from energy, and with the declining price of energy, it's created a real revenue shortfall for the county. So is there a way to communicate with that fact to people, but then also to help them understand what those implications are, and to get them to help participate in making some of the decisions that might need to go along with that, whether or not it's finding a new revenue source or cutting spending. Let's see. This is an important one. This third one: are you more interested in transparency and education, getting informed feedback, or both? And so sometimes, just like on that spectrum that we talked about, sometimes it's really just about transparency and education, or transparency and informing. And sometimes we find that local governments really want the feedback, and then most of the time I'll actually say it's both. And so that's sort of a key question in terms of how you design this. The interactive types of things like Adam was talking about with meeting mode, that's a really great way of getting some informed feedback. We've got some ways of sort of adapting our simulation so that you can use it with almost as a survey with a representative sample. And there's a great example of that, as I said yesterday on Colorado Public Radio here in Colorado, about how a research team used it that way. And we've got a number of local governments that are using it in place of representative surveys, because it's a way of getting some better type of feedback. This last one is the initiative linked to a current ballot proposal. Current should be current and future ballot proposal. We often find local governments that really feel as though they need to make a change to their tax structure, and often that's done through a ballot proposal. So depending on how you answer these goal setting questions, it can really help determine what your strategy might be. So then in terms of your strategy, just what are the challenges? Do you need to have scientific validity or just high levels of participation? As I was mentioning, it's becoming the case with some new research methods that you can actually sort of combine these two, some scientific validity with a representative sample, as well as just getting some high levels of participation. And once again, which of these are more important to you, or both? And there's a way of doing that. And then next question about what is your budget for the initiative? There's some very low-cost ways of doing budget engagement, and then there's some that cost a little bit more. The good news is that if you're using something online, the cost of online is getting more and more affordable as more local governments do this. That old saying about tech, better, faster, cheaper is really becoming the case, and that's sort of a nice thing. But we have seen some very effective budget engagement initiatives that use what one budget director calls chips in a bucket, where they simply go to a grocery store or a library and give people some chips, and they've got a bucket of expenditures, and ask people to put their chips where they think where they'd like to see the funds go. And there's some effectiveness of that for sure, and it's just sort of different levels of sophistication and sort of what your budget is and what your goals are. Next, select and build the tools. We use online, face-to-face, or both. We're big proponents of doing both, and there's some nice ways of putting that together. Social media and earned media are useful, and this is an area that Megan, if you want to chime in, feel free. Otherwise, I've got another slide in a little bit. But these can be very useful in terms of getting people here. Mayor of Nashville did when they launched, the mayor put it on her Facebook page, and they had 2,200 users spending more than 10 minutes each on their simulation in about 3 weeks' time. So it can be very effective. Implementing it, who should be involved? Is this a communications function? Is it a budget office function? Is it a city or county manager function? We found that the best implementations involve all three, especially a collaboration between the budget finance function and communications. Do you need external support? Most of the time, there's really not too much external support that we've seen, but occasionally we've seen it where extra facilitators have been hired for some face-to-face meetings. Maybe a little bit of communication support, advertising, that type of thing. And then the next question about how will you communicate your initiative and how will you get people involved. And this is where I want to show you something. This is where Adam and Megan have not seen this yet. But I just wanted to, I'm flying to North Carolina tomorrow for a conference with the North Carolina Budget Officers Association. And we're going to be highlighting what City of Charlotte has done. This is a promotional video that the city made that I actually, as far as budget humor goes, it's about as funny as it gets. They created a video that just sort of shows regular people in the course of their life taking about 10 minutes to go through their budget simulation and provide input. And so they created this kind of funny video that ends with this guy, and you can't see his legs, but he's dangling his legs in a swimming pool, and he's got a laptop, and he's using their online simulation. And we thought that was actually kind of funny. So they did some good creative work there. One thing we want to emphasize is that you don't have to be a city of 900,000 to do something creative and funny like this. This is a screenshot from a video made by Cambridge, Minnesota. Cambridge has a population of 8,677, and what they did, in Prairie Home Companion fashion, they got Lena and Oli talking to their mayor, and I think they probably just made it with an iPhone, and they just have these two community residents that are actors that play these two characters from Prairie Home Companion in their upper Midwest accents, just talking about why it's important for residents to learn about the budget and participate and share their view, and the mayor talks about why she wants to hear from them and so forth. And I just thought that was sort of funny and sort of effective. Granted, they're a small town of 8,677, but they've had clearly the highest percentage of their population of anybody using this. They had, I think, about 400 or 500 users, which is a pretty high percentage to go through their budget engagement. And Megan, I don't know, have you given, I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you given much thought to how you're going to publicize your budget engagement initiative in La Plata County?
A little bit. We're kind of doing a grassrootsy kind of thing to begin with, trying to engage we have probably a couple hundred folks who serve on our various boards and commissions. So we want to activate, kind of engage them and educate them and turn them into ambassadors. We will do some, larger, we want to build on that to kind of have some momentum under us before we're taking it to the larger community. But at that point, once we have built some of that momentum, we'll be doing some more of some of this video stuff. We're in addition to the Balancing Act tool, we have some videos in development that tell our story a little bit in terms of the services we provide and that kind of thing. So the Balancing Act will, how we promote the budget engagement itself will come a little bit later. Right now we're sort of focusing on the storytelling element.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to what you do. It's been very thoughtful all along the way, so I'm looking forward to tracking that. So I think that sounds great. Do you think you'll be using much social media?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. And if you want, I've sort of got a collection of social media type things that people have done. City of Charlottesville did a funny little flyer that they put in the annual utility bills, and they also got a very high participation rate. And I think what they did was they stacked up rocks on each side of like a fulcrum, so it was like balancing a teeter-totter, and it was just sort of a nice, inviting way to get people to participate. And for a little town, I think they had more than 1,000 participants, a town of about 38,000, so they did very well.
Great.
So, all right. Yeah, and that's one thing we also like to do is, in the spirit of Megan and Adam being here, is that local governments are not really competitive with one another, especially about something like this. And so there's all sorts of ways of sharing and adapting and stealing ideas from other people, and we're always glad to serve as a conduit for that. All right, so let me keep on going here. Collecting and analyzing. Are there priorities that have emerged? Adam talked a little bit about that. We always have this question about what's enough in terms of participants and also the representativeness. And there's some ways of doing some target marketing. We've had some cities that have taken iPads into the mall and just asked residents to spend 5 or 10 minutes going through a simulation and providing their input, taking it to parks and libraries and all sorts of things like that. We've also got some examples. I won't go into them today, but just some ideas about how to present the results. And Adam, I might even ask you if it's something that's suitable for public consumption. If you'd share with me what you prepared for your city council. We're always interested in how staff sort of package this up for decision making among senior staff and elected officials.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. I can even send you our report. All of our stuff is we're pretty open about it, so that's not a problem.
Most of the time it's a public document. So yeah, I'd appreciate that. I sort of collect these things. City of Austin has a really nice one that they do, and at some point I think I might ask them to do one of these webinars as well. And then communicating results. How do you share it with elected officials? That's just what we're talking about with Adam. And then how do you share it with the public? And it's important that if the public are going to spend 5 or 10 or 15 minutes or even an hour at a meeting, that they sort of understand what's been done with their input. What was the input? How when it was aggregated and how is city staff using it? Whether or not they're taking it verbatim or they're doing what Adam was saying, which is to sort of understand what their intent was and their purpose, and then maybe doing something a little bit different with it. This next slide, it's a kind of a busy slide. It violates the rules of PowerPoint, but I just wanted to sort of do a little bit of a cross-reference between the spectrum up here in the yellow where it says inform, consult, involve, collaborate, etc., and then talk about how that sort of fits with online simulation and just what that usefulness is. And I'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of this PowerPoint. But just sort of talking about how it can be used if your goal is collaboration, how you can use it with community advisory boards, large public meetings, etc. And then face-to-face, we see face-to-face coming into play when you're trying to involve, collaborate, or empower. We didn't even put the budget hearing because we don't really consider that much of a budget engagement. We just haven't heard too many good stories about how that works. Sometimes people have sort of derisively referred to as 3 minutes at the mic and not very useful to much of anybody. So we didn't really put it in here, but it probably could go in over here. And then there's also another tool, which I'm not going to talk about today, called Taxpayer's Seat, which is just sort of a handy-dandy accountability tool that where you can estimate what taxes that are paid that are that are eligible to be used by local government, and then how that's broken down for residents. And if anybody has any questions about that, I'd be glad to share with that a little bit later. And then this is sort of a special circumstance, and that I just want to talk a little bit more about, where we're finding more and more, unfortunately, local governments are seeking to do budget engagement because the financial future is not looking very good for local governments, even with an expanding and growing national economy. The National League of City is sort of foreseeing that there might be a pretty tough year and contraction in local government funding. I know that this is across the board, and not every local government is seeing this, but they're really seeing that there might be some tough times ahead. And as I was mentioning earlier, what we've learned, especially from elected officials, is that when there is some type of contraction or retrenchment, that they very much appreciate having some public engagement about and public participation about how to deal with these tough issues. And this is where there's a fair amount of information. This is a quote from a guy named Benedict Jimenez, who did a study in 2013 on cities and counties, and I think it was actually cities, after the Great Recession. And what he found is that when local government leadership proactively tried to undertake participation methods, really anything any type of outreach or communication or simulation, that they found that there was that there were options, that those cities were limber in terms of being able to be flexible and to find solutions. And the quote is, in participatory cities, nothing is off the table in dealing with a fiscal crisis. And in those cities where the city leadership did not sort of build that relationship and try to explain what was going on and engage people in thinking through, they had many fewer things that they could do, and it was often, a little bit more of a coarse budget cutting as opposed to coming up with some more creative solutions, or some solutions that might be a little bit less across the board painful. This is a quote about the value of surveys. I'll just say personally, it sort of pains me when local governments put too much stock into surveys. Surveys can be useful in terms of identifying preferences, but budgets are usually much more dynamic, and I think they just require a little bit more context and sort of evaluating multiple things at once. And there's been a lot of research that's shown that when you have something dynamic and complex like that, that a survey where you just say, I like this more than that, is not that useful. And I found this nice quote from these two budget scholars at the University of Connecticut, that they just say that that when you don't have those budget constraints and those service needs that decision makers have, or the cost of the choices, that citizens appear to find acceptable any government service that don't offend them. Little is learned from such efforts. And so most results from budget surveys I've seen is that everybody kind of likes everything. They like to have streets that are paved without potholes. They like to have rec centers and parks, and they like to have libraries that are open late and things like that. And so without having those same constraints that you all as decision makers face, the value of a survey is, at least I think, is limited at best. And then this is a nice quote from Carol Ebden and Amy Franklin, where they just talk about sincere preferences. And I think, Adam, this reminded me of some of the stuff that you were talking about this disconnect between what citizens expect from government and what they're willing to pay for. And a simulation is a really good way of getting those preferences. And I'm working on an article right now that this quote came from 2006, and in the same article they talk about the value of doing budget simulations as a way of getting those sincere preferences. But the difference is, in 2006, the internet was in a completely different place, and so there's been at least 2 or 3 evolutions in internet technology and the ability to create inexpensively and quickly simulations that can be used that can actually reveal those sincere preferences. And so this last part of the quote is, we have not utilized participation techniques to adequately capture this information. Now with these relatively inexpensive software tools, cloud-based software tools, there's a much greater opportunity to do that. And I think that's it. So why don't I just see Adam and Megan give you guys any last opportunity to make any last comments, and then if there are any questions or comments, either raise your hand or ask it in the chat box. But Adam, Megan, anything else to add?
Well, if Megan doesn't have anything, I do have one other thing I can throw in the ring.
Go ahead, Adam, and then we'll see if Megan wants to add anything after you.
Sure. So besides our regular budget engagement, which I described, we also actually do empower residents in some ways to make decisions regarding the budget. So we have a, I think, quarter-cent capital improvement sales tax, and a portion of that is actually dedicated to each council district, and our council members select a representative to sit on a committee, and those representatives can allocate those funds. So besides just the meetings and the information that we get, we really do put power into their hands to make decisions regarding the budget.
Interesting. One trend, and this is a counter-instinctual trend that I've seen, is that it's not exactly an absolute rule, but I've noticed that the larger the city, it seems like the more likely they are to want sort of a stronger engagement level. That the larger the city, they tend to be further to the right on the spectrum of participation. Once again, this is not evaluative, but just observational, that they seem to sort of move in that direction. And the smaller the city, they seem to be a little bit more towards the informing side. And I don't know, I don't have that validated with scientific research, but that's been our observation as we've sort of worked with a lot of places. Megan, you have anything else to say before we sign off?
No, I think I've said all I can. Looking forward to seeing how this all rolls out as we kick it off in January.
Good. Well, I am too. If there's nothing else, let me just thank all of our attendees, and special thanks to Adam Blum and to Megan Graham for sharing with us what you're doing in your county or your city with regards to budget participation. It's exciting to hear, and look forward to hearing what comes next for you all.
Thanks for having us. I appreciate getting the opportunity.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thanks, Megan. Take care, everybody. Bye.